There is a specific kind of silence that happens right before things go entirely wrong. It's the moment you realize the ambient sounds of the night have vanished. No crickets, no wind, just the heavy rhythmic thumping of your own pulse in your ears. Tonight, we leave the cold walls of corporate greed behind and step into a much darker corner of the world. Welcome back to Retribution Wire. Tonight, we bring you two deeply unsettling accounts of isolation, paranoia, and the terrifying realization that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen closely. Because sometimes, the things we fear aren't just in our heads. They're standing right behind us. David liked the night shift because the world was quiet. As a freelance logistics coordinator, his job required him to drive long, lonely stretches of highway across the state, delivering high-value legal documents and specialized medical hardware between small-town hubs. He was used to the dark. He was used to the way his headlights swallowed the asphalt, carving out a brief, fleeting tunnel of vision in an otherwise endless void of black trees. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday when his GPS took him off the main interstate. A heavy storm had caused a multi-car accident 30 miles ahead, completely blocking the highway. The navigation system rerouted him onto State Route 9, a narrow, two-lane road that cut straight through a dense, state-protected pine forest. The screen on his dashboard estimated the detour would add an hour to his trip. David sighed, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, and turned up the volume on his radio. The rain started a few minutes later. It wasn't a sudden downpour, but a thick, heavy mist that clung to the windshield, forcing his wipers into a steady, rhythmic click-clack. Outside his windows, the pine trees stood like tall, rigid sentinels, completely cloaked in shadow. There were no streetlights on Route 9, no gas stations, no passing cars. Just David and the road. After 20 minutes of driving, the radio began to crackle. The upbeat music degraded into a harsh, aggressive burst of white noise. David reached over to change the station, but every frequency yielded the same result: a low, rhythmic static. Shh, shh, shh. He turned the audio system off completely. The sudden silence in the cabin felt incredibly heavy, broken only by the steady hum of his tires against the wet pavement. Then, his headlights caught something on the left shoulder of the road. David slowed down slightly as he approached. It was a man walking in the same direction David was driving. The figure was wearing a heavy, dark yellow raincoat, with the hood pulled tightly over his head, shielding his face from view. He walked with a strange, uneven hitch in his stride, jerkily, as if his limbs didn't quite fit together properly. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, and his head was angled slightly toward the dirt line. David felt a sudden spike of unease. Finding a pedestrian out here, miles from civilization in the dead of night during a freezing mist, was deeply unnatural. As he drove past the man, David looked out his passenger window, hoping to catch a glimpse of a face under the yellow hood. But the hood was a dark, empty cavity. The man didn't look up. He didn't raise a hand to wave for a ride. He just kept walking, his jerky shadow stretching out behind him under the yellow glow of David's taillights. David shook his head, checking his rearview mirror. "Good luck out here," he muttered to himself, pressing down on the accelerator to put some distance between them. In the mirror, the yellow shape quickly vanished into the dark mist. 5 minutes passed. The road twisted sharply to the right, descending down a steep incline. David kept his eyes locked on the white lines painted on the asphalt. The trees seemed to be growing closer to the road now, their heavy branches hanging low, blocking out what little moonlight managed to pierce the storm clouds. David looked down at his dashboard clock. 2:31 a.m. Then he looked back up at the road. His breath caught in his throat. His foot slammed hard against the brake pedal. The tires screeched against the wet asphalt, the anti-lock brakes pulsing violently as the car skidded to a halt just 20 feet away from a figure standing directly in the middle of the right lane. It was a man in a dark yellow raincoat. The hood was pulled down. He was facing away from the car, standing completely still. His limbs had that same stiff, awkward geometry. David's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His headlights illuminated the bright yellow fabric perfectly. It was identical. The exact same tear along the bottom seam of the coat. The exact same dark mud stains on the hem. But it was impossible. David had been driving at 50 miles per hour for the last 5 minutes. There was absolutely no way a human being on foot could have overtaken his car, let alone stood waiting for him in the middle of a deserted road. "What the hell is this?" David whispered, his voice trembling in the quiet cabin. He didn't put the car in park. His foot remained clamped on the brake, his engine idling with a nervous hum. Slowly, the figure began to turn around. The movement was ungodly slow, a series of sharp, mechanical twitches. First the shoulders, then the torso, then the neck. David leaned forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. He expected to see a mask, or perhaps a prankster looking for a reaction. When the figure fully faced the headlights completely, David's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Underneath the yellow hood, there was a face, but it wasn't human. The skin was the color of spoiled milk, tightly stretched over a skull that was subtly deformed, elongated and asymmetrical. But it was the eyes that made David scream. They were massive, completely black, and entirely devoid of eyelids. They stared blankly into the high beams, reflecting the light like 2 pools of dark oil. The mouth was split into a wide, unmoving grin, revealing a jagged row of small, needle-thin teeth that looked less like bone and more like rusted metal. Panic took over. David slammed the gear shift into reverse. He stamped on the gas pedal, and the car roared backward, tires spinning wildly on the slick road. He backed up for nearly 30 seconds, his engine screaming in protest. Finally, the road straightened out slightly. David smashed the brakes, shifted into drive, and spun the wheel hard to turn the vehicle around. The car skidded, its side panels grazing the low-hanging branches of the pine trees, but the nose cleared the brush. He straightened the wheel and buried the gas pedal into the floorboard, flying down Route 9 at 70 miles per hour. The road seemed longer now. The twists and turns didn't match his memory. The mist had thickened into a dense, gray wall that reduced his visibility to mere feet. He checked his dashboard. The GPS screen was completely dead, just a static grid of green lines. The clock read 2:14 a.m., the exact time he had entered the detour. David's chest tightened. He realized with absolute horror that the landscape was repeating. He was trapped in a loop. And then his headlights caught it. Up ahead, walking on the left shoulder with that strange, uneven hitch, was the man in the yellow raincoat. David didn't slow down this time. A primal rage overtook his fear. He locked his jaw, aimed the center of his hood directly at the figure, and pressed the accelerator completely to the floor. 80 miles per hour, 50 feet away, 30 feet. Just before the bumper made contact, the figure stopped walking. It snapped its head around with blinding, unnatural speed, looking directly into David's windshield. The pale face, the oily black eyes, and the rusted needle smile filled David's entire field of view. The creature didn't dodge. Instead, it raised one pale, long-fingered hand out of its pocket and pointed directly at David's face. The car hit the figure, but there was no impact. The car passed straight through the yellow shape as if it were made of smoke. Instantly, David's dashboard lights died. The engine cut out completely. The power steering vanished, and the car became a heavy block of metal sliding down a dark hill. It skidded off the asphalt, spinning violently into the mud before crashing sideways into the thick trunk of an ancient pine tree. The impact shattered the driver's side window, showering David in tiny shards of glass. For a long time, there was only the sound of cold rain dripping through the broken window onto his face. David groaned, his vision blurry. He tried his door, but it was pinned tightly against the tree trunk. He was stuck. He reached into his pocket, his trembling fingers wrapping around his cell phone. He turned the phone toward the broken window to illuminate the dark woods outside. The white light pierced the rain, cutting through the fog. There, standing just 5 feet away from his shattered window, was the yellow raincoat. The creature was leaning forward slightly, its long, pale fingers wrapping around the jagged frame of the broken door. The oily black eyes stared down at David, inches away. Slowly, the creature opened its mouth wider, and from deep within its throat, a sound began to emerge. It was a perfect, flawless mimicry of David's own voice, echoing back at him in a terrified whisper. "What the hell is this?" The light on David's phone flickered once, and then went completely out. Some secrets want to be found. Others want to hunt. If you are listening to this in the dark, take a deep breath. Check your locks. Look toward the shadow in the corner of your room. Because our second story takes us out of the wilderness and brings the nightmare somewhere much closer to home. Somewhere you consider safe. Let's begin Chapter 2. Sarah bought the Victorian-style house in upstate New York because it was cheap. It was a massive 3-story property built in the late 1800s, featuring beautiful hardwood floors and a wraparound porch. The real estate agent admitted the house had sat empty for nearly a decade following the passing of its previous owner, an eccentric historian named Arthur Pendleton. Sarah, an independent graphic designer who worked from home, saw it as the perfect restoration project. During her first week, she focused entirely on the main floor. But by the second week, the heavy silence coming from the upper levels began to bother her. The house had an attic, a massive, cavernous space that spanned the entire length of the roof. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, armed with a flashlight, Sarah climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the top floor. The attic was exactly what she expected. Dusty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and smelling heavily of aged paper. As she walked across the floorboards, her flashlight beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating stacks of old books. As she explored the deep corners of the room, she noticed something unusual about the back wall. Built directly into the thick plaster wall were doors. Not one, not two, but 3 small, identical wooden doors. They were short, barely 4 feet high, designed to access the crawl spaces beneath the sloping roof. Curious, Sarah walked over to the first door on the left. The brass handle was covered in grime. She turned it. It clicked open easily, revealing a standard dark crawl space containing some old insulation rolls. She closed it. She moved to the second door in the middle. This one was slightly stiffer, but with a firm turn of her wrist, it swung inward. Inside was a collection of old framed oil paintings depicting grim, unsmiling faces from the turn of the century. She closed that door too. Finally, she stepped in front of the third door on the right. This door felt different. The wood was darker, almost black, and the brass handle was remarkably clean, completely free of the dust that blanketed the rest of the attic. Sarah reached out and grasped the knob. It wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. There was no keyhole on her side, just a solid, unyielding brass plate. Sarah placed her ear against the cold wood of the third door. She expected to hear nothing but the wind rattling the roof shingles outside. Instead, she heard a sound that made her entire body go completely rigid. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded like fingernails slowly dragging against the interior side of the wooden panels. Then, the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, wet, whistling sound. The unmistakable sound of something breathing heavily through its nose, just centimeters away from her ear on the other side of the wood. Sarah stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the light, and flew down the attic stairs, slamming the heavy access door behind her. She sat in her brightly lit kitchen for hours, trying to rationalize what she had heard. Rats, she told herself, her voice sounding hollow. It's just a large nest of raccoons or rats in the insulation. She resolved to call an exterminator the following morning, but that night, the house refused to let her sleep. At 3:15 a.m., Sarah woke up to a sound vibrating through her bedroom ceiling. Her bedroom was located directly beneath the right side of the attic, the exact side where the third door was built. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking slowly across the floorboards directly above her bed. They would walk 5 paces to the left, stop, and then walk 5 paces back to the right. Sarah lay completely paralyzed in her bed, staring at the white plaster ceiling. The footsteps continued for an hour before ending with a loud, metallic click, the distinct sound of a door latch snapping shut. The next morning, the exterminator arrived. He was a gruff man named Tom who had worked in the area for 30 years. Sarah escorted him up to the attic, pointing toward the back wall. "I think there are animals trapped behind that third door," she said. Tom walked over to the small doors. When he reached the third black door, he tried the handle. It remained locked. He frowned, leaning in close to inspect the frame. "Miss," Tom said, scratching his chin, "this isn't a crawlspace door. Look at the hinges. They aren't standard. This door was installed from the inside of the wall, and there's no seam along the edge. This thing is bolted flush into the structural timbers." He took his heavy flashlight and tapped the center of the dark wood. It didn't produce a hollow ring like the other doors. It sounded incredibly dense, like solid iron. "Whatever is behind here, it wasn't meant to be opened from the outside," Tom muttered, looking uneasy. "And to be honest with you, I don't hear any scratching. There's no sign of droppings anywhere near this wall. I can't help you with this one." Tom packed his tools and left, refusing to take any payment. That night, the storm returned, unleashing a furious gale that rattled the window panes. Sarah tried to stay downstairs, keeping every light in the house turned on. But at exactly 3:15 a.m., the power died. The house fell into pitch blackness. The television cut out, leaving only the violent roaring of the wind outside. Then, through the darkness, a sound came from the central hallway. It was the sound of the heavy attic staircase door slowly creaking open. Skrrrt. Sarah's breath hitched. She was sitting on her living room couch, her smartphone flashlight her only weapon. She aimed the beam toward the open doorway of the living room. Thump, thump, thump. The steps were coming down the stairs. They were heavy, wet, and unhurried. Sarah dragged her legs up onto the couch, pulling a blanket over her chest. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. They walked along the hardwood floor of the hallway, moving closer and closer to the living room entrance. The flashlight beam trembled violently in her hand. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the light. Sarah could see a shadow stretching into the room. It was long, unnaturally long, suggesting something tall and skeletal. From the darkness just outside the light beam, that same low, wet, whistling breath emerged. Then, a voice spoke. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like an old man, dry, raspy, and incredibly weak. The voice didn't threaten her. It just asked a single, terrifying question that echoed through the dark house. "Why did you open the first two?" Sarah couldn't breathe. She realized with a horrific wave of understanding that the 3 doors in the attic were a sequence. By opening the first door, she had unlocked the perimeter. By opening the second door, she had broken the seal. And the third door hadn't been locked from the inside to keep her out. It had been held shut by the weight of the first two doors being closed. The shadow in the hallway moved forward, stepping into the white circle of her smartphone light. Sarah didn't see a face. She saw a mass of ancient, yellowed burial shrouds wrapping around a frame that was far too tall to be human. Where the head should have been, there were only two ancient wooden hands holding open a pair of long, rusted iron shears. The creature took one final, sudden, blindingly fast stride into the room. The flashlight dropped from Sarah's hand, hitting the floor and rolling beneath the couch, plunging the living room into total, permanent darkness. Some doors are best left locked, and some roads are best left untraveled. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, let us know in the comments below which chapter chilled you the most. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Retribution Wire to ensure you never miss our weekly tales of darkness, mystery, and vengeance. Look out for the subscribe link appearing on your screen right now and click it to join our circle of listeners. Until next week, keep your lights on, lock your doors, and remember to look behind you.